When your child is battling cancer, there's not much you can do. And there were times where, I was in Cincinnati and my daughter was getting treated in Philadelphia. I would have to FaceTime her, watching her hair fall out, tubes hooked up to her. As soon as we hang up the phone, I would just break down and cry.
For me, this is really about learning, because I think that there's a lot of men that could benefit from really having a new understanding of what it means to be a caregiver.
Yeah, definitely.
And we have generations and generations and generations of men teaching men that we have to be strong and tough and brave and impervious to pain and to not cry, because there's no crying in baseball or football.
Right.
I'm curious how, specifically for you, Devon, because your daughter got cancer. Like, you brought your football player champ mentality to this cancer battle, and I believe that was part of the reason why she kicked its ass.
Right.
But what about you? Did you ever struggle?
I think people get the wrong perception when they follow, me on Instagram, because they only really see a lot of the good, motivating videos. And a lot of people think that I was strong all the time, which I really wasn't. Being a man, a black man, a professional football player, we're taught to be that rock. We're taught to always be strong. Football taught me to have that warrior mentality and not to let people see you weak. But my daughter was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. As parents, we all make that promise to our child when they're born, whether you say it to them or not, that you're gonna do everything you can to protect them. And I honestly felt like I failed as a father. And I just immediately started blaming myself for not noticing it. But when your child is battling cancer, there's not much you can do. Right? It's really their fight. The only thing you can do is just be by their side and let them know that they're not in this fight alone.
I can't even imagine what that must have been like for you. From chemo to the medicines to how you had to care for her differently.
You basically are thrown into a world that you have no idea what's going on, right? I went from being a professional football player to a nurse, right? I was doing everything that the nurses were doing, just learning, taking different classes in the hospital to see how you're supposed to administer medication, how you clean certain areas, how do you deal with them mentally, right? Because 4 years old, my daughter thinks she's a big girl. She's very independent, wanting to do things on her own. So it's knowing when to step in at the right time, especially when, she's at a place where she's really weak from the amount of chemo that she's getting.
I can't think of a harder thing to do than all day long to make sure somebody else is taken care of. Are there support groups for caregivers?
There are, because feeling seen and feeling that moment of connection can be a huge breakthrough for people.
So huge.
Caregiving is something that is so difficult emotionally, spiritually, and can be incredibly isolating. And so the people who do it are so strong. And yet we don't associate it with strength at all.
There were times where, I was in Cincinnati and my daughter was getting treated in Philadelphia. I would have to FaceTime her, watching her hair fall out, tubes hooked up to her. As soon as we hang up the phone, I would just break down and cry. And recently, while I was writing my book, I told her about those times in Cincinnati. And she looked at me and said, "You know what, Dad, I had those same moments where I wanted to break down and cry with you on FaceTime, but I didn't. And when we hung up the phone, I would go into the bathroom in the hospital and just start crying." Mm-hmm. And I realized then that I dropped the ball because I didn't allow myself to be vulnerable in front of her, because if I did, we could have just sat there on the phone crying together and really talking about the things that we were going through. Now we just cry all the time. It doesn't even matter what we talk about.
I know, you got me crying right now.
Yeah, so.
That's interesting, because I think the world sees you as Iron Man, right? You're fighting for your girl, but what would have happened if you would have gone on Instagram and said, I need help? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Can you imagine all the men that could have been oh my God?
I think, caregiving brings out some of your most vulnerable moments, right? I think it brings up grief, it brings up anger, it brings up sadness. And as men, we haven't figured out necessarily a way to unpack that and talk to other people about it. We swallow it. It's a poison of sorts, right?
How does that affect one's emotional state? This whole idea of suffering in silence.
Well, across the board between men and women, caregivers have really high rates of stress and depression. And because one of the things that happens when you're caregiving is you prioritize the health and well-being of the person that you're caring for. And I think it's worse for men even because of that isolation and that failure to really reach out to the resources and the services that are available.
There's a feeling that a lot of caretakers experience, but they don't talk about it. It may be looked at as self-centered, but when you're 26 years old and you're having to take care of your wife because she's dealing with something, it alters your life.
Absolutely. I think so.
You know, we live in a day now where everybody compares their life to people's on social media, so you may be seeing one person living this life and we're over here just running on E a lot of the time.
So there needs to be like an Instagram for depressing shit. You know, like, just like not sexy Instagram. What are you really going through?
Right.
I think that's a universal thing of like, I can't talk about this because if I talk about this, I will be ostracized. Whatever it is that you're going through, you think is too heavy to share or too dark. There are people out there that your message of the real darkness that you're facing will be their light, right?
Mm-hmm. You know when they send you the hospital bill and they do that giant scare thing where they show you how much it was supposed to cost? And it's like $300,000. So many people, they get that amount.
Families are losing everything in order to try to save their everything.